Excellent. Okay, so I'm really glad to be here with y'all virtually, talking about something that I've been really into for the past several years after kind of being raised as a wildlife ecologist. So hope that you can learn something new. So I'm Christine Wilkinson. I'm based at UC Berkeley, and I'm currently talking with you from Oakland, California, which is the unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone. And today I'll be giving you an introduction to participatory mapping and how it can be a useful tool for wildlife conservation in the right circumstances. So our roadmap for today, I'll be giving you a little bit of an overview of what participatory mapping is. Then we'll talk specifically about participatory mapping for conservation. I'll give you some examples of tools you can use for participatory mapping, both paper-based and digital. Then we'll talk arguably about the most important thing regarding participatory mapping, which is the ethical considerations and the logistics. I'll give you a case study from my work in Kenya briefly, and then of course the Q&A. So first, what is participatory mapping? So essentially it's community members expressing their spatial knowledge about what is happening on the ground in their communities. And so participatory mapping recognizes that local communities are the experts about their space, right? They are the ones that live there. They're able to know what's going on with the resources, the needs that they have, the wildlife, et cetera, more than researchers who might be coming from outside of those communities. It's also able to elevate and really prioritize people's views and values about where they live, essentially, giving them political empowerment if the researcher is able to form that bridge, which I'll talk more about later. So maps, those of you who have done GIS or done any kind of cartography or mapping have realized that mapping is not a science, it's an art, right? So it's very subjective, and the way that we express ourselves through maps often goes into really, huge political decisions, right? Zoning, things like voting, census, all of these different things are related to the way that maps are drawn. So if you think about it that way, we kind of want to use participatory mapping to take away some of those top-down aspects for our maps and bring communities in from the ground up. And then participatory mapping can also contribute to equitable decision-making that really recognizes that there are various ways of knowing. So we're taught, as scientists, I think many of us are scientists, are taught that there is this kind of objective way of knowing, right? That there is just one objective way to see things if we just uncover the facts. But objectivity actually does not exist, and there are many different ways of knowing that can be equally as important as each other. So participatory mapping can kind of uncover those ways of knowing that don't get heard often enough, especially in the science field. So while participatory mapping has in some sense been around for a long time, the idea of integrating it into development, conservation, and other fields partially has its roots in like the participatory rural appraisal movement that took off in the 90s, but it's really evolved and kind of changed since then. So for today, I'll be focusing on spatial maps, but there are actually many other types of participatory mapping that are more conceptual, like risk mapping and priority mapping and some other types of mapping. But today we're going to go all spatial, so that's just a caveat. So why use participatory mapping to help wildlife conservation efforts? Well, we know that wildlife co-occur with people in even the most pristine landscapes. And even though early conservationists focused on maintaining a pristine wilderness and separating people from wildlife, we definitely know that that's unrealistic now. And we also know that interactions between people and wildlife can shape ecology at many different scales. So what does it mean to share our landscapes with wildlife? Well, wildlife have to navigate human infrastructure like roads and fences, and human activities like tourism and noise pollution. But they also have to navigate less tangible elements like human risk perceptions about and tolerance for wild animals, and how those human factors translate to exclusion or extirpation of these animals and have cascading effects on the ecology in shared landscapes. So we can really address this enormous complexity by integrating local community perspectives with data on ecology and animal behavior to try and enhance our understanding of how humans and wildlife can share landscapes over the long term. And this is where the mapping comes in. So I wanted to show you this figure from a 2009 paper by Rahima White and colleagues that argues that solutions to conservation conflicts should be spatially explicit or mapped and should be informed by interdisciplinary data to really fully understand and address these challenges. So we should be including a myriad of spatial data like social factors, wildlife and human behavior, and economics, etc., to more justly and realistically predict and solve these conflicts in conservation. And incorporating participatory mapping with other methods is a meaningful way to understand how human perceptions and values interact with and influence ecology and animal behavior. So we can use participatory mapping to involve communities in the research process from the ground up and to gain these spatially explicit community perspectives that help us as scientists and managers to understand the dynamics of conservation challenges and, most importantly, just and sustainable solutions to those challenges. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the tools and tech. This is by no means going to be exhaustive, but we'll just do a little overview of it and we can discuss it more later. So physical tools, right? So in regions where there's little internet access or when you have lower tech budget, you might opt for some of these classic original participatory mapping tools. And you might be surprised to learn that some of the earliest map-making tools of humankind, which is ground maps, like you can see an example of here, are still used in some participatory mapping contexts even today. But meanwhile, paper maps are our most common physical participatory mapping tool. So I think we're all familiar about how paper maps work. I've included an example of that here. But for those of you who work with historical spatial data, you kind of know that digitizing paper maps can be a huge hassle, right? How do you take these drawings and put them into, say, a GIS software and analyze them? But fortunately, there are at least 2 initiatives that address this. So I wanted to highlight Local Ground, which is on the top right here, and that was developed out of UC Berkeley, and Field Papers, which was developed out of Stamen Design in San Francisco. So both of these softwares allow you to print your paper map, do the participatory mapping, and then upload the photo of the map back into the website for them to digitize for you or to georeference for you. And I'll be explaining more about how Field Papers in particular works in my case study, because that's what I used. There are also a lot of digital tools we can use for participatory mapping. So I've just thrown a few up here. Most of these generally allow either the researcher or the participants to add their data to a digital map in points, lines, or polygons. Some of them, like ODK, Open Data Kit, also have survey capabilities so that you can do some really rich, customized participatory GIS. Most of these, aside from Esri's ArcGIS collector, are also open source, which is great. But I wanted to highlight Symbology in particular, which I recently came across. And it's a platform from an organization called Extreme Citizen Science. It's specifically designed for non-literate participants, and this is from an example project where people can report on wildlife crime. It shows the participant these symbols and these panels rather than words, which is pretty unique, that they can kind of choose from as they go through the app. So all that is to say, there are a lot of different digital participatory mapping data collection platforms that have their pros and their cons and their different uses. And there are, of course, a lot of examples of amazing participatory mapping projects, not just in conservation, but elsewise. And I'll just walk you through a couple of the ones that I find really useful and fascinating. So the anti-eviction mapping project is based out of San Francisco, and I actually fought my own court case against my landlord in San Francisco, so I know how volatile it is there. And this is just one example of these Ellis Act evictions. So essentially, community members can go in and put in their experiences with eviction, put in their experiences with various tenants' rights issues, not just this map, but lots of other resources that they have for this project. And not only is the community able to contribute their experiences, but people can go in and use that, right? They can go in and see, okay, what are people going through with eviction here? How can I learn more about my rights as a tenant? What are the things I might have to be afraid of spatially as gentrification kind of sweeps outward from these core parts of the city? And that's kind of what happened to me, actually. Then, more on the science side of things, I know probably all of you have heard of iNaturalist, which was actually developed from someone who went to UC Berkeley. Now it's based out of Cal Academy. And this is arguably like the biggest citizen science participatory mapping science project in the world. And so people can kind of go around in their communities and note where they've seen different species, get their species identified by the community if they don't know what they are. And more excitingly, if you're a researcher, you can go in and download these data and use them for your own projects, or you can start your own projects using citizen science data in a really easy, kind of well-vetted platform, which is iNat. And now kind of highlighting a couple of use cases in wildlife research and management specifically for participatory mapping as far as people going in and trying to use it for research. So this project was looking at the bowhead whale in Alaska and working with indigenous groups to not only understand where the whales are, but whether they're thriving and how their behaviors do or don't differ from the past. This map on the left is kind of talking with indigenous leaders and community members and figuring out where they've seen these whales over the past, decades, centuries, so on. And this project ended up opening up more research questions about there being 2 distinct bowhead whale populations here instead of 1, which is what the researchers originally thought. So pretty neat. And then just another example, this project, they had participatory mapping conducted to help facilitate the protection of these indigenous lands in the Peruvian Amazon and their biocultural resources, since there was a plan for the construction of a potentially very destructive road through their lands. So the researchers went in and had essentially these participatory mapping sessions to really elevate and kind of boost an understanding of what the indigenous folks are prioritizing and what their needs are to kind of get them on the map, so to speak, in these zoning and construction planning. So you have all likely used participatory maps. So if you've used Waze or OpenStreetMaps or some of those other popular apps, you're actually using participatory maps. And all of these apps that I've put up here and many others allow community members to note various relevant aspects that are happening around them. So Waze, for instance, lets people upload when there is a traffic accident or construction, and the app updates the traffic patterns and predictions for you to use while you're driving. OpenStreetMap, on the other hand, in some ways is an alternative to Google Maps because it allows community members to make the base map from scratch. So to basically contribute roads, streets, places of interest, etc. I found that it's particularly useful in my rural Kenyan field site where Google, at the time of my original study, hadn't been able to send their mapping vehicles through all of these rural roads, but community members were going out and mapping them themselves into OpenStreetMap, which is pretty neat. So since many of us work with wildlife, we have to ask ourselves, when is participatory mapping appropriate for wildlife research and management? Because it's not always appropriate. And so as far as content, you have to be thinking about what information is needed on species, locations, movement, resource use, etc., and whether you're able to let the community guide that, right? A lot of the time, and I'll talk more about this later, our funding structures that we have in this field don't really allow for flexibility of the community guiding these things. And there are some ways around that, and there are some ways that just need to be systemically changed. So thinking about whether that information you need is something that the community can provide and will actually help the community themselves and benefit the community to provide, because this is research with people, not on people, right? You should also be thinking specifically about who you need the information from and why. So are you needing people who are hunters? Are you needing people who are farmers? Are you needing community leaders? Are you needing women? What are the reasons that you need folks to participate? Who is the research going to benefit, and how can you get them in the room? And making sure that you're not wasting people's time, but also making sure that you are having the right people involved in this process to get the information that they need and that you need. And then this one's a little bit tricky. So community land tenure length can be really important for participatory mapping in general, but especially for wildlife research and management. If you have people that have lived on the land for generations, they're going to have a completely different relationship to the land and to its wildlife and its resources than people who have just moved in. And that doesn't mean that the people who've just moved in don't have their valuable opinions and needs as well, but you just might not, for example, in the bowhead whale example I just gave you, those people had been living on that land for generations, and they were able to speak to whether wildlife had faced certain issues in the past or in the present that they didn't before. So those are important things to think about when you're designing the participatory mapping with the community. And then as far as positionality, so you want to be thinking about what your own personal decision-making capacity is, or that of your organization. So we, again, like to think that we are objective in science, and we're not. We actually do have the ability to bring this research into action, or to at least serve as a bridge between communities and people who they might not be able to reach, but that you are reaching, like government agencies, et cetera. So kind of doing a lot of soul searching and self-reflection on what your decision-making capacity is and what you have to offer the community as an asset rather than just as a researcher. And just being super honest about that. You also need to be thinking about what is your ability to build and maintain relationships with stakeholders. Are you working with people in your own community that you already know? Are you going into a community where you have to kind of build those relationships from scratch? Do you have the time and the funding to really build and maintain that trust with people? What are the drawbacks to the types of time commitments that you have? Participatory mapping and any participatory research really involves building relationships. This is sort of a funny thing. I know maybe not all of you are a wildlife crowd, but I've talked with a lot of wildlife ecologists and behaviorists about this, and about how we are starting to slowly realize as a field that we need to involve people and think about people in conservation, which is sort of a duh, right? But a lot of wildlife ecologists have gone into this field kind of afraid of people or shy of people and being like, I just want to hang out with the animals. And that's just something we really need to acknowledge, kind of that those deep held fears that the wildlife fear might have of engaging with people, and collaborate with the right people to learn how to build those relationships or work with the people who can. And then I mentioned this before, but what is your flexibility of topics for mapping? So are you going in with a set hard question that you need information for, or are you able to be flexible to allow the community to guide the process? When you bring the community members in is really important for this aspect, right? Are people coming in from the research design, right, from the very beginning, or are you designing the research and then bringing people in? So it's generally my philosophy to try to be as flexible as possible within any funding constraints that you have, because you have to remember that, as a conservationist, you are doing this to benefit not just wildlife, but people, and you're working with the people and not on them. That kind of brings us to ethical considerations for participatory mapping. So you have to think about who is involved, right? There are going to be power dynamics in any culture, whether it's your own community or otherwise, that you need to be thinking about and consulting with the community about before you decide who is going to be involved alongside this community. So is it a patriarchal society? Are women going to be afraid to speak up when they're in the presence of men? Are there certain racial groups or socioeconomic groups that are going to kind of feel marginalized or left out, either logistically or in the space itself? You also have to be thinking about where and when the sessions are being held. So I like to say we should be bringing, instead of bringing people to the table, we should be bringing the table to people, thinking about where is it going to be the easiest for people to get involved in these sessions and to kind of speak their truth. So for example, are you in a community where most people go to church on Sundays and you're trying to hold things on the weekend? That might not work out. Are you in a community where all of the women are farming during the day and you want women in these sessions? You need to be thinking about childcare, all these different things. And then lastly, how is the community involved? When are they buying into the project? Are they helping to develop it? Are they helping to iterate on it and make it better? These are kind of, ways that you can be elevating folks in the community, even within the process itself. And then we've got logistical considerations. So you should be thinking about things like internet availability and your funding. So what kinds of tech are you able to bring into the field? What kinds of tech are you able to charge in the field? Do you need to use paper maps? instead, and what supplies do you need for those? These are all things that I'll talk a little bit about in my case study. One thing that you don't think about until you get into it sometimes is how many people should be participating in each session. So if you're using paper maps, you want to be thinking about, like, are your maps going to be legible later on if you have too many people drawing on them at once, and kind of mitigating that. If you're trying to have people have a conversation with one another and kind of have a group session where they're fostering dialogue, you might want to think about not having too few people. The other important part is map orientation and literacy. So we don't always work with non-literate or with literate populations and people who have seen a map before. So you need to be thinking ahead of time and doing a lot of kind of test cases in conjunction with the community about what types of map orientation actually work, and what people need in order to get past the fact that maybe they haven't held a pen before. All of these aspects that you need to be keeping in mind. So onward to our case study. So as I said, I'm a wildlife ecologist by training, and my research was helping me to understand the dynamics of carnivore ecology and movement in Nakuru County, Kenya. But we also wanted to understand whether the ways we were characterizing these ecological patterns on the landscape were different from how community members perceive those patterns around conservation. So before I describe the case study, I'd like to set you up with some background. The study site for this project is in the Rift Valley of Kenya, and in around 2 adjacent protected areas, Lake Nakuru National Park and Soisambu Conservancy. And Lake Nakuru National Park, which is to the west, is one of only 2 fully fenced national parks in Kenya. And Soisambu Conservancy to the east is a wildlife conservancy that's also a livestock ranch, and it's partially fenced. And then Nakuru City to the north is one of the fastest growing cities in East Africa. It's directly adjacent to the national park. There's also a lot of dense development and immigration of people in the region around these 2 protected areas. And I'll give you some context, since it's really important for the participatory mapping aspects. So as you saw on the previous slide, the national park and the conservancy kind of function as ecological islands amid an influx of development and land subdivision. And this photo is a great example of the subdivided agricultural landscapes around the 2 protected areas. Then we've got Soisambu Conservancy, which is not just a wildlife conservancy, it's also a cattle ranch, and it's been a cattle ranch since the colonial era. It has thousands of cattle, sheep, and goats, and some ag. And issues around wildlife are deeply controversial. So this might look like a photo of the military, but it's actually the Kenya Wildlife Service, which is militarized largely to stop poachers. But because of this dynamic and the region's colonialist history and the sequestering of valuable remaining rangeland and resources inside of the protected areas, the communities around these areas have a really complex relationship with the protected areas. And the people that I know in the communities are really interested in getting involved in wildlife and conservation planning. And then lastly, the electrified perimeter fence around Lake Nakuru National Park was put up in the 80s, primarily to deter intruders and to keep rhinos in. But it's also currently maintained to alleviate human-wildlife conflict and to demarcate the boundary of the park. So all of these kind of shifting stated purposes of the fence are really important to consider when determining how people are relating to this fence and how the wildlife are moving through the fence into the communities. So a little more background about that fence. Before we started participatory mapping, we put up these camera traps on the fence, and we saw that at least 27 mammal species are crossing in and out of the national park every day, with spotted hyenas doing this downward-facing hyena that I like to say the most often. So hyenas are known to cause a lot of conflict with livestock, so the fence's ineffectiveness on this front was pretty concerning as far as the communities go. And we also looked at fence maintenance for the park fence and found that maintenance is sporadic and kind of has this net zero effect. And we only saw 14 maintenance events on our cameras during the year that they were up, and there was no real trend as far as effect. And then the wildlife often breached that hole again within 1 day, as you can see right there. So at the same time as seeing all of this, we'd also noticed anecdotally that community members viewed this fence as being useful. So we knew that people's perceptions of the fence's effectiveness and the wildlife in the communities might be just as important as actuality when we're thinking about the conservation outcomes here. So I'm going to be using the term human-carnivore conflict during this case study. So I just wanted to pause and give you a definition of that for context. So human-carnivore conflict is our way of describing the negative interactions that can happen between carnivores and people or their livestock. and people's perceptions of risks that carnivores pose. So a negative interaction might be a puma killing someone's goat or even chasing a person while they're hiking. It also includes human actions like human retaliation toward pumas, whether it's legal, like a permit to shoot the offending puma, or illegal, like poisoning or other methods. But meanwhile, maybe you've been out on a hike or a bike ride. You've been worried about what it might be like to encounter and be attacked by a puma, even though that event is really, really rare. But your perceptions are really important, right? Perceptions influence actions like retaliation. They also influence acceptance toward carnivores and legislation about them. And that leads into the case study. So we know from our definition of human-carnivore conflict that human perceptions are important and that human perceptions can be different from what we see with recorded evidence or scientific evidence. So we wanted to see how people's perceptions of livestock being killed by carnivores were different from the livestock killing events that the government had recorded across the region. And we looked at two questions to this effort. So first, how do verified and perceived livestock predation compare spatially and in relation to ecological variables and infrastructure? And second, how do social variables correlate with quantities and distribution of perceived livestock predation? And for this study, we compiled data on verified livestock predation by carnivores. So what I mean by verified is that, for instance, someone who experienced an attack on their livestock might call Kenya Wildlife Service, and then Kenya Wildlife Service has a process to collect evidence and verify which animal was attacked and by which species. Of course, we also used participatory mapping. So we chose 16 major villages outside of the protected areas. We focused on villages that were near to weak spots in the fence. And I'll intentionally dive a little deeper into the methods so you can get a sense of how this works. So we had nearly 400 participants from these villages with about a dozen participants in each session so that the completed maps they were drawing on would be legible to us later. And mapping groups were gender stratified to encourage people to speak openly with one another. Importantly, we made sure that participants knew we were students, that we didn't have sway over conflict management issues, and that even though we served everyone lunch, there would be no compensation for participating. We also made sure that people knew that sessions were voluntary and that they could leave the sessions at any time. And because many people hadn't viewed maps before, map orientation was really important. So community members were oriented to the map by asking them to point out places of interest or popularity, like the highway to the main city, Nakuru, or the churches that they were attending, or the conservancy, etc. And because at the time, the paper-based maps that we were using weren't as detailed, we also had blown up atlases like the ones you can see here, comprised of satellite images that people could refer to. And the sessions were conducted in a combination of Swahili, Ma, and English, depending on the participants' needs. And we would guide these sessions, and often we would see community members actually kind of animatedly helping each other out to find the landmarks during the orientation. And then community members participated in one-on-one interviews first, and they were assigned a unique pen color for drawing on the map so that we could associate their interview data with what they feel is important in space, which is kind of unique to our study. This isn't something that's necessarily done in participatory mapping, but it's something that we wanted to have as an asset. And we were asking them questions about their risk perceptions about carnivores, livestock attacks, and their attitudes toward carnivores. We were also asking them about where they'd prefer carnivores live in this landscape, among other things. As far as drawing on the maps, each unique question had a symbol, either a point, a line, or a polygon that was associated with that question. And community members were shown these symbols as each question was asked. And then we digitized the maps using fieldpapers.org, which uses this QR code and reference points that you can see here to georeference the photo of the completed map. So basically associating the photo of the map with the coordinates, which takes up this massive step that you would normally have with digitizing. And then after that, you just get an army of undergrads to essentially trace and digitize these polygons and points and lines. So from this process, we were able to see that about 20% of the study area showed a mismatch between people's perceptions about livestock kills and the livestock kills that were recorded by the government. So these areas in red are places where people have essentially perceived a lot of livestock kills. They've kind of recorded a lot of livestock kills on the map, and the government hasn't recorded a lot of livestock kills in those areas. And the opposite holds true for the blue. So those are areas where the government has recorded a lot of these verified livestock kills, and the communities are recording fewer of them. So our hunch about there being these big differences between these two data sets turned out to be correct, and we now know where specifically to focus community outreach efforts. What predicts these differences? So since we knew from the fence crossing analyses that carnivores are moving through the national park fence into community lands, we wanted to see if distance from protected areas predicted the difference. We also wanted to see whether season or vegetation resources can explain the difference between these two types of conflict, since we know this is typically a factor when looking at verified conflict. And we used road density as a proxy to understand how anthropogenic activities might or might not explain the disparity in the two data sets. We found that with increasing distance from protected areas, both verified and perceived conflict decreased, which is kind of what we predicted. Remember those animals crossing the fence at these weak points, right? We also found that road density was positively correlated with both verified and perceived conflict. So this could be because where there are people, there are more roads. And in this region, there's a lot of immigration, a lot more roads being built. And wildlife in this really densely developed area are likely more nocturnal. So people are likely experiencing these conflicts at night near their homes rather than during the day when animals are out to pasture in these less road dense areas. But vegetation greenness had opposite effects on perceived and verified conflict. So NDVI was positively correlated with perceived conflict and negatively with verified conflict. This could be due to overinflation of perceived conflict in and near highly vegetated regions that carnivores could be more likely to use as habitat. But diving more deeply into this perceived conflict dataset, what about people who are guarding their livestock actively at night but are still reporting perceived conflict? Are there any notable regions where nighttime guarding of livestock might not be working? And we actually don't see any notable clusters in perceived attacks reported by people who are guarding their livestock at night. But when using geographically weighted logistic regression, we saw that there were local regions where certain social perceptions and values might be influencing an excess of perceived conflict reports for people who guarded their livestock at night. So for instance, here I've circled two regions showing clusters of perceived conflict where people tend to guard their livestock at night. And these clusters are predicted by these participants' beliefs that their children face threats from carnivores while traversing these landscapes. Similarly, on the second map, we can see that this cluster here is predicted by participants' beliefs that there's a shortage in wild prey in this area. So managers can use these local clusters and their predictors to decide on targeted outreach for these particular communities. So for instance, are the people in these regions facing threats from carnivores due to the fence being breached more in those areas? Or are there ways to provide these particular communities with transport for their children to get to school without needing to walk and face these real or perceived threats, etc.? I won't go any deeper into what we analyzed for that study, but instead I'll just pivot to a few more examples of what we could do by integrating my mapping data with the ecological and behavioral data. So the first example is in orange is the per camera trap night approaches of carnivores to the fence. So, you know, in the middle here are these areas where there are a lot of carnivores approaching and crossing the fence. And the purple shows a kernel density estimate of where community members have seen or heard carnivores over the year of the study, which came from the mapping data. So we can see that the carnivores that are crossing near Mzee village may likely be going into the community lands and not simply just crossing the fence into the conservancy, which is what we thought. We can also assume that the hotspot to the southeast is due to the fact that there is no fence on the southern boundary of the conservancy. But what about the hotspot over here to the southwest? So it seems like these areas have fewer carnivores crossing according to our ecological data, but a number of things might be going on here. So there might be carnivores that are denning outside of the park. We also know that carnivores cross into the conservancy here on this boundary. So it might be possible that they're actually exiting into the communities through the conservancy boundary. And lastly, we know that people are poisoning in that area and that their perceptions of carnivores are very negative. So it's possible that people perceive the carnivores to be very abundant because of their negative experiences that they've had and these perceptions. And here's one more example that also showed us future directions we should consider for working with the community and the ecology in this region. So I used some GPS collar data from our spotted hyenas, and we determined their home ranges from kernel density estimation. So here we've also mapped the hyena sightings from our community participatory mapping data. And as you can see, part of the core range of one clan is adjacent and even overlaps with 2 communities right here where people have said they see many spotted hyenas. So this same hyena clan moves to and from the conservancy every day, as you can see represented by this individual. And from the 2 sighting hotspots in the south, we've since learned that there are 2 hyena clans that we were unable to collar and study thus far. So the mapping data essentially helped us to learn this, and we'll be trying to collar those animals in the future. We can also see from this hyena's range over here that the community of Kikopi might be experiencing conflict with these animals kind of leaving the conservancy, and we should consider reaching out to them in the future for more effective community-informed carnivore management. So these are kind of great examples of the mapping data, not only providing data, but also providing helpful information for future research and for future community-involved conservation. Takeaways from these studies is that there are quantifiable spatial mismatches in these kind of participatory mapped and verified conflict data sets. And there are ways to predict these risk perceptions and the attitudes that are influencing them, meaning that these are great jumping off points for addressing conflict. Also, risk perception might not always reflect underlying attitudes toward carnivore conservation. And most importantly, integrating these disparate data streams and using inclusive spatial planning with communities can help with disentangling conflict, elevating community voices, and ideally co-creating targeted coexistence measures. There were also some other kind of mapping-related lessons that I learned from this process as well. The first one is around politics and logistics. So there are some very interesting political issues around village boundaries that I faced during this session. So one of the villages, I would go to the chiefs each time to kind of say, this is what I'll be doing in your community. Is this okay? Kind of getting that bureaucracy and that permission. And there was some argument between 2 of the chiefs around where their boundaries were that I actually didn't know about, and ended up doing a participatory mapping session in a jurisdiction that was disputed. And so we kind of had to work through that. So it's something that you have to think about. This community mapping, since maps hold all of this power, can really get you embroiled into tough conflicts. And the best you can do is really listen and have these conversations early on as much as possible. Another thing is about positionality. So in an ideal world, I would have been completely not present in those sessions, right? My presence biases results, and I know that, especially as a Westerner. But we needed, unfortunately, to have me drive my 2 assistants, the master students, around to these sites, these Kenyan master students, even though I kind of took a back seat. So I'm not sure how much I biased these results, despite a really concerted and thoughtful effort to minimize bias. Another one is around culture and logistics. So something that we faced that we had to really kind of have a lot of conversations around with community members in these sessions is we wanted people to feel comfortable writing on top of each other's symbols on the map. And no matter what we would say, it would really take a lot of urging to have people kind of write their experiences on top of each other's. So I think this is a little bit of a kind of cultural factor that ended up featuring in our logistical challenges around that. So something to keep in mind is that there's a lot of power and emotional kind of cultural considerations, but there might be logistical ones as well. The next one is around COVID-19. So I was supposed to be back in the field doing more community work last year, and because of COVID-19 and a lot of these other issues, I wasn't able to do so. And that's something that for me, when I initially started my PhD, which I've now completed, it was because my friends in Kenya were asking me for these tools, right? Were asking me for these abilities to kind of elevate their voices, and I felt that I wasn't qualified. So I started my PhD with the intention of just being in a space where I could gather tools for my friends. And then COVID-19 essentially made it so that I had to not be there in that space when it was the right time to be there. And that's something that I think we've all been thinking about, those of us who do field research in other communities, around how we can deal with these ethical challenges related to things that we can't control. So something to have a conversation about. But there are also some really good lessons. So people were keen to talk about their experiences with other species with which they're experiencing conflict. So species like buffalo, as well as issues around benefits they'd like to receive from the national park. And so by fostering these conversations during the mapping sessions, I was able to serve as a bridge between community members and the government agencies that were able to address some of these issues for people and get them kind of resolved for people. And so the plan for the future is also to write a research and working paper jointly with some of these community members about some of the mapped research regarding conservation planning for carnivores and other species. So that was kind of this participatory mapping for action, and really understanding that we have to consider our ability to be that bridge. So I think overall, we need to remember that even the most well-meaning researchers might not be able to do things perfectly. It's important to make sure we can plan for and really thoughtfully mitigate any potential challenges as much as possible before engaging a community in a participatory mapping project. So ultimately, participatory mapping is a useful tool that could be used alone or in concert with ecological tools like I showed you here. And because maps are inherently subjective, yet they're used for many powerful political purposes, participatory mapping's most important function, in conservation might arguably be political empowerment for communities. That really requires us as scientists to recognize our positionality as this connector between research and action. So I'll just leave it there, and I'll acknowledge all of my field team and my undergrad team and the communities that I worked with and all of these excellent funders. And I will take any questions that you have.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Christine, for that excellent presentation. That was super interesting. Just a note before we get into the Q&A that you can still drop your questions in. Please feel free. We have collated all of them that have been dropped in the chat so far, but please keep asking them throughout, and we will do our best to get to you all. So normally I would start with an opening question, but actually Lauren asked exactly what I was going to ask. So Lauren, do you want to jump in and ask your question?
Okay, now I have to find my question. Just a second. And I'll turn on my camera so you can see me. Okay. So weren't there other questions? You want to start with me?
You took my question, but asked it even more effectively, I think. So.
Okay. So I'm not a biologist. I am a cultural anthropologist, but I'm working with biologists on a participatory mapping project up in Nunavut, Northern Canada. And I'm coming in as the person who's used to working with people. So I'm kind of coming from the opposite perspective. And my question is, and this is kind of going to show where I'm coming from, is what happens when you're using traditional cartographic maps and community members have difficulty with orienting their spatial perceptions to this form? This idea that we don't see the world from a bird's eye view, and things like lakes and rivers change with seasons. And so people's experience actually out on the landscape and interacting with wildlife doesn't necessarily translate well into these static bird's eye view maps. From your fieldwork experiences, what are some ways to help with that orientation of people who may not be used to working with maps to kind of translate their environmental perceptions to fit our kind of Western maps?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's so important, right? Because it dictates how people relate to the map and where they end up drawing things. So in our sessions, there were a few different things that we did. So we had those kind of detailed atlases that corresponded to panels on our paper maps to kind of help people. And we had them labeled with landmarks. And the fun thing about these sessions is that a lot of the time you had older people and younger people in the sessions. And the younger people were the ones that were like enthusiastically picking it up and then kind of guiding the older people into understanding the landscape. The other thing that we did several times was actually take the maps and go outside and kind of stand on the road and like point around to the different directions that the maps were showing. And so you're like, oh, the river is this one over here. Oh, this is the Conservancy road is there, blah, blah. And that was something that was super, super helpful. And then we kind of, to get the conversation started, it's a little bit, daunting, right? If someone has never seen a map. We had like a set list of like landmark types that we would come into the orientation with and be like, here are like the main things that I think every community could point out. And then let's dive in deeper and have you point out the things that are important to you on the maps. And kind of go outside or, work together with the younger folks who like are very self-aware and figure out like where this church is, where this school is. And that's kind of how we did it. I'm convinced that it was not a perfect method. I don't think there is one. But I know that so that's like how we kind of orient them, because I needed to do GIS work, right? Like I needed to get this into a GIS software and analyze it. But not, I think the bowhead whale one that I showed in the examples didn't have, yeah, they didn't have like a GIS, but necessarily they were kind of talking with people and like asking them to describe. Or in the Peruvian one, they didn't use really like maps as we're used to it at all. They had them kind of draw them from scratch and draw the base maps themselves. So that's kind of another method depending on the goals of the project.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the just your expanding on what you actually did, because that's always very helpful. Thank you.
Christine, you mentioned the different age groups, and something I was curious about was, in my research in East Africa, it seemed like age had a lot to do with social status, and that sometimes like focus groups would be split up by age group, but it sounds like it was super helpful for you to actually have them combined. Can you talk a little bit more about why you decided that, and how you decide to split up those groups?
Yeah, so our split was essentially women and men, for the reasons that are common around the world, which is patriarchy. And we intentionally wanted to have like elders mixed with younger people because we wanted to foster that dialogue about what was happening. So a lot of the elders have lived in that landscape for a long time, while not all, but a lot of the younger people, there's a lot of immigration to that region. Like it's just very almost like a melting pot of people immigrating in and lots of land going up for sale. So we wanted to intentionally have that mix of like people who like moved in 2 years ago and like bought some goats, and people who have had their herds there for like a long, long, long time. And the conversations that were coming out of that, like I have a whole section of this I didn't talk about where I was like kind of fly on the wall, and the field assistants were also taking a lot of notes about just the conversations that were going on. Were really, really fruitful and really interesting, and kind of I think helped to engage people that would otherwise be really quiet. We were we did a few trial sessions of this, and we're trying to be conscious of like, are there certain people who are like marginalizing others in these conversations and that kind of thing? And of course you can't mitigate that completely, but I feel like the ability to have these kind of cross-age conversations made things more lively and exciting for people, was the energy that we got.
Very cool. That's super interesting. Okay, so we'll get to some of the other participant questions now. David, do you want to jump in with yours?
Talia, do you want to read it out? David doesn't have a mic.
Oh, sorry, yes. Apologies, David. Okay, David asked, how do participatory mapping best practices differ based on land ownership regimes? So for example, community ownership or stewardship of large areas of land compared to a mosaic of more privately held places or parcels.
That's a really, really good question. And I don't know if I'm the expert to answer it, but if I were to hazard an answer, so the place where I work has a lot of different like ethnic cultures, right? And a lot of different immigration into the region. And because of that, I think that it actually sort of helped the sessions to not have these kind of entrenched power dynamics where like everyone's, say, in the same community, in the same tribe, that kind of thing. And not everyone knew everybody else is another thing. So it kind of changed the dynamics in that way, maybe for better or for worse. Whereas I have worked in Maasai communities that are more like community-held lands like that before, not on mapping, but on like other types of social science work and ecological work. And it's the power dynamics within a more closely knit community are more obvious and perhaps more important to take into account. But I haven't actually done mapping sessions in a community like that before.
Okay, thank you. The next question is going to be from Gadu. Do you want to jump in?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. I'm not from the conservation side. I'm actually from the tech side. But my question is more from the people. So I belong to a tribe up in the Nilgiris biosphere, and we spread over around 300 villages. and it's surrounded by a few large wildlife sanctuaries. So along the buffer region, there's a lot of man-animal conflict, mainly through elephants, tigers, and sloth bear, right? And there are currently like ongoing mortalities as well. So the conflict happens normally like sort of in the small agricultural holdings that are in the buffer zones with the wildlife sanctuary. Now, typically like sort of, so this is reality for us, right? Like my community. So every day, right, like there's someone from the family, right, like who goes and sits watch and then they burst crackers and make sound to right like drive away from because that's sustenance there. Now a number of them of late like there's a lot of youth as well, so there's local colleges, there are a lot of undergraduates there. So I was trying to explore some technical solutions to that, and cameras at the edges and things like that, but even more simple data collection, right? So all these people every day or every night see some wildlife, right? Like and they note it. So just enabling them with some of these participatory with the tools, right? Some simple tools um, will hugely like increase the data from a data collection point of view, right? If we can work off some incentive, so that's a huge amount of data. Just imagine sort of throughout the year when all these people, so that there might be 300 400 people every day like observing what they see. So that's a disconnect that I see, and it's just a thought, right? Like, and how do we bridge that?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind as far as just a simple tool that you can use if you wanted to kind of foster that is Open Data Kit, which is an open source free platform that lets you kind of make these customizable surveys and also take GPS locations. We used it for my project that I just told you about. The other interesting thing about this is not only can you geolocate whatever information they put in, but you can also take photo, like you can include like take a photo in your survey that they're doing, and you can make it as short or as long as you want. And then it's just like you put this app onto their ideally an Android phone. Now where it gets tricky is if they have not a smartphone, right? And I've heard of lots of different people trying to just have like send a text message to this thing, but I have to look that up for you and see like what are the ways that we can kind of engage people in that don't have a smartphone. But Open Data Kit is definitely your go-to, I would say, if you're trying to get some wide-scale geo-referenced data collection from people.
Thank
you. Next, we had a question actually from registration that we thought was interesting. One of our registrants, Katrina, asked, how do we use the tool to allow enough depth and nuance around the different social perspectives and narratives that inevitably surround the issues we're exploring? And you kind of covered that a little bit in your talk in terms of integrating, like understanding, the school children that's the thing that's making people worried about this. But can you speak a little bit more to kind of like how you capture that complexity?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I really wanted to have people draw on paper maps because of internet and whatever connectivity issues, while also having various demographic and attitudinal data associated with what they're drawing in space. So actually, like, maybe invented, maybe reinvented, I don't know if anyone's done this before, the method of like they get their own pen color. There's a unique pen color per person per day, which of course is going to depend on how many people you need, right? Like I could do that because I had a dozen in each session. And in the survey, the anonymous survey, you take a picture of that pen and the color of the pen, so that they can stay anonymous while their data is also associated with their spatial data. That's like getting kind of in pretty deep, but I think another way to answer that question would be to really tailor your mapped questions to what the community thinks is important and what they think is kind of driving what's going on. And in order to do that, like, frankly, it just takes a lot of, iterative pre-testing, coming in with the maps and maybe just not even with the maps and just having these conversations with people, focus groups, before you get started on what kind of questions you're going to ask, if you don't want to do that whole interview pen color thing. And maybe there's a better way for that. And there's also definitely a better way for that if you have like an internet connection and devices for people to use. But I just didn't, so.
Fair enough. There was another registration question actually along those lines about connectivity. A lot of people had questions about what's the best tool to use if we don't have internet connection, if we're in a very remote area. And I know you use paper. Are there tools that of the tools that you mentioned, do any of them work well in those settings, or do you really recommend just sticking with the paper maps and then translating it later?
So I think it depends, right? So, for Open Data Kit, which I was just talking about, like you can, if you're doing like a very simple thing that you want geo-referenced, you can like take a picture of it, geo-reference it, and then later when you have internet connection or when the researcher is like, here is a SIM card or whatever, it can be stored and then uploaded later. So that is like one digital option you could use, but a lot of them require you to, first of all, at the very least, you need to have charging capabilities, and we don't always have that. So that's the reason why I used field papers, although local ground is also another option, and there might be others that basically, like ahead of time, I chose the maps that I wanted on the interface. I printed them out, and then they get automatically georeferenced. And I kept alluding to how georeferencing sucks historically. And the reason why is because you typically would have this map and you'd have like a couple of landmarks on the map that you have to then pin, and be like, I know where these locations are, and try to like create a way to kind of pin that paper map in space in your digital software. And these local ground and field papers both just do that for you automatically if you take a decent picture of your map. So that's what I ended up using. It did still involve like printing out 600 maps and all of this stuff, which is a pain, but it definitely solved any problems I would have had with charging, funding for devices, internet connection, etc.
Okay, great. I recognize we're at the hour, so if anyone has to run, that's fine. We'll post the recording here. Christine said she had a couple more minutes for us, so I think we have one or maybe two last questions, and then we'll wrap up and go into our normal chat time. So one we had from a participant here, Angela, and she said, considering that human-wildlife conflict incidences in Kenya are generally underreported due to ignorance, insufficient or slow compensation processes, etc., did you and your team use any other methods to verify the actual incidences versus perceived? So kind of like verifying that verified data.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's something that we wanted to do, but we didn't get to do. And speaking to that, though, so when I was taught, I didn't get to go too deeply into the paper, but part of what we wanted to look at the verified and perceived, I mean, I like to say perceived because there's not really another word for it, but like those are easily just like also real carnivore conflict instances. And the comparison between them was to kind of show the Kenya Wildlife Service, who's in charge of, doing all of this and has issues with it through bureaucracy, funding, whatever, where they're missing points, right? Like where they're coming up short and not doing enough. It wasn't just to show like there are differences in these data sets and we need to be collecting both. It was to show like there are places where people either are having their livestock killed or are afraid of that you are not addressing and that you need to be able to do better. Because yeah, and Angela, it is a huge, huge issue there that I could go on and on about some of the conversations I've had with community members about that issue. So yeah, it's something that we'd like to do, but we weren't able to do.
All right. Okay, last question I think is going to be from Katie. Do you have a mic, Katie?
I do.
Awesome.
Hey. The question that came to mind is not one that I'm dealing with right now, but I'm just really curious about is how, after this is over, how do you ensure that the community can have and use and build on all of this mapping information to help them into the future? And I think you started to address that a little bit at the end because I know you couldn't be there this year. But yeah, just curious about those strategies.
Yeah, I think it's like a critical question. So thank you for asking it. In my case, so at the beginning of these sessions, and as we were deciding like whether communities wanted to participate in them, I was asking them like what they would like to get out of it at the end. And the answers were a few. So one of them is like people actually really want like paper maps of where they live and like kind of what their opinions are about the resources and that kind of thing. So those are things that like I'm printing out really nice maps. I'm bringing them these maps that they want to use because, as I said, there are all these like political boundary issues as well, and like just aren't really any zoning maps at all for those areas, let alone like resource and prioritization maps. So that's something that I'm creating for them based partially on just what I've been able to map out there and based partially on their own answers. Something else that they wanted that we've kind of partially addressed, but we're still working on it, is like me serving as a bridge for the community about these issues. So like taking the time to come in and talk with them for the research was, great for me, but also like they were saying like, we are not able to reach the community warden. We're not able to sell our goods to tourists because of all these middlemen. And these are things that like we've already kind of bridged that gap, brought the community warden in, found ways for people to sell some things without middlemen, found ways for people to try and get connected to how they can actually go view the wildlife in the national park, which is something they want. We're also starting up, people have a lot of really interesting opinions about the Conservancy, which is partially because of its colonialism that it's steeped in. But we're starting to try and figure out ways to get communities into the Conservancy because they actually don't get to go in. There's a weird deal that the hotels and the Conservancy managers have that don't let communities visit like the national park would. And we're working on that. So I have been very conscious of my position as someone who talks to the Conservancy managers and who talks to the Canadian Wildlife Service to be able to bring and voice these concerns and literally give the phone numbers of these people to the people who need it with permission, right? But that just like there's just a massive disconnect otherwise because people are busy and they don't have the resources to go out to find the community members, or the community members don't have resources to go into the park. So those are like less like spatial related things and more like conservation, management, connection, community building related things. And then the other thing is that I feel like co-authorship is really important. So I was able to co-author with one person on the last paper, but most of the participatory mapping stuff is still unpublished. And it's something that when I go back, hopefully this year, we'll see, Kenya, or early next year, that I want to kind of bring those conversations back and ask community members, okay, we have these data, we're trying to, this is kind of where I'm coming at them from. This is what you discussed wanting to come at them from. How do we want to do co-authorship? Do we want to do it by village? Do we want to do it by certain individuals getting involved? All of that kind of thing, just to really boost that that visibility of the villages and what they're going through. So, and not just of like scientific papers, but of like working papers that can then be used in some of the planning is the plan. That was a long answer, I'm sorry.
No, cool, thank you. Yeah, I'm sure it's hard when everything you're creating is all digitally based and then within the community, they probably don't have great resources to keep that part up, I assume.
Yeah, it can be tough. Like it's internet costs money. You pay with your airtime, with your little airtime chips. So it's not like you're just paying monthly and you can just add in another thing to keep up with. So.
All right, well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And thanks so much, Christine, for the excellent presentation and responses to our questions. We're going to wrap up now as we're a little bit over already. But make sure to look into our event next week. Ellie dropped in the link there. We're going to have a discussion on how the pandemic is influencing conservation tech. And that should be super interesting. As always, we're going to hang around for a few minutes to chat, so feel free to stay on if you'd like to. But otherwise, we'll see you next week. Thanks, everyone.